Hello everyone, and welcome to our first of two videos on political parties. We have a number of topics on this. I'll tell you what will be in each video. The five main topics are, first, what are political parties? Then we'll talk about what they do. And then the puzzling question of why does the United States have a two-party system as opposed to a multi-party system? And we're going to go through the evolution of what we call American party systems, going through our history and showing how, while we've always had two parties, they have been different. They have changed in their relationship. And I have some interesting maps that I think will help you understand that. So that's the first video. That's this one. When we go to the second video, we're going to take up what we sometimes call the three faces of parties. In other words, that we mean three different things when we talk about parties. One, political parties as organizations. The political parties in the electorate, like the people who identify with the parties, who are not part of the formal organization of the party, but they are people who align themselves or identify with the party. Like, people say the Republicans and Democrats. And then the parties in government, where we talk about their role in the governing system. And mainly what I want to talk about there is how they factor into our elections and how they feature in our system of democracy at the highest level. So first, what is a political party? Political parties are organized groups of people with a common political ideology, usually, with common values and objectives. They're different than interest groups because, if you recall, interest groups focus on one particular issue, and political parties bring together many different issues under an umbrella, usually, almost always. Our parties in the United States certainly do that. They normally have an ideology. That is, the party does. It's not necessarily true that all the voters in the party share that ideology, but there tends to be an ideology, and that holds everything together. And their purpose is to acquire government power and to exercise government power. In other words, to win elections, to staff the government, and then when they're in there, to advance their policy agenda. They exist. Parties are organized at every level of government, the national level, the state level, the local level. But everywhere, at all levels, they are mainly focused on acquiring power. That's their main purpose. Staffing the government is sometimes the way we put it. Political scientists as a whole believe that parties are an essential part of any system of representative government. In other words, that you need strong, effective political parties to have a system of representative government or liberal democracy. That is a widely held belief among political science, that you just can't do it without parties. You can't have a system of representative government that works without political parties. That is a common belief. So specifically, what do they do? No matter where you find them around the world, you'll find they do these things. They select candidates to run for public office. They help them win, either by election or appointment. They take positions on various public policy issues, as I said, usually many issues. They tend to frame the terms of public debate, which often involves communication between political party officials and the news media. They tend to try to frame the issues, telling the media, this is how you should see the issue of immigration or war and peace or whatever it is. Here are the stakes, here are the sides, that sort of thing. And they do the same for voters in general and for citizens in general, for those who vote and also people who just are paying attention. They educate us about the issues, at least they try. They also try to mobilize political participation on election day. We call that get out the vote. GOTV is short for get out the vote. And political parties are heavily involved in doing that. They organize legislatures along party lines, meaning if you look at any legislature in our country, it's divided up. How do the people get organized to decide who's going to vote for what? They organize as party members. Now, sure, sometimes people cross party lines, but by and large, it's the party identification of legislators that determines most of what they do. That's the way they see themselves. I'm a Republican member of Congress. I'm a Democrat member of the Senate, that sort of thing. In a parliamentary system, no, we do not have a parliamentary system, but in one like the United Kingdom, where they have a parliamentary system, they also select the chief executive. That's what a parliamentary system is. In a presidential system like ours, we vote independently for president, and we also vote for legislatures. But in a parliamentary system, we just vote for members of the parliament. That would be in the UK. And then the members of parliament choose the chief executive. So that's an additional function that parties perform. In the American system, we have a very unusual sort of strong two-party tradition, which I'm about to explain. But therefore, our functions are just a little bit different. They're similar in most regards. But one of the things about this is because there are only two major parties that have any chance of winning, they tend to be big tent parties. That is, they aggregate the interests and the demands of many different kinds of people and groups. Many of them might disagree with each other, but the parties try to resolve their conflicts and get them together for election day. They do the usual staffing of government, recruiting candidates, funding campaigns, get out the vote efforts. And as I said, they do coordinate and organize legislatures. It is also usually said that our two-party system promotes political stability. This is a thing that political scientists have believed, and it is a belief we increasingly wonder if we're right about. In other words, do we really have political stability or not? We'll talk more about that. They simplify the choices for election. You just see a bunch of names if it weren't for parties. I mean, you look at the ballot and you see R's and D's, and it helps you decide who to vote for if you have a party ID, right? Informing and educating the voters, and creating public policies and party platforms, which I'll talk a bit more about down the road. Now, why? Here's this puzzle. Why do we have a two-party system? Why do we not have 10 or 12 or 3 or 6? And there's several reasons, and I'm going to list all of them. There are 2 slides where I list them, and you'll see the next one comes up in a bit. First is because we have an election system, an electoral system, a way of deciding who wins elections that favors having a two-party system and places smaller parties at a disadvantage. Now, there's a thing called Duverger's law, which says that an electoral system that has single-member legislative districts with winner-take-all elections, in other words, where you vote, there are candidates run, and only one of them can be the winner for each district. In systems like that, third parties, fourth parties, etc., have very little chance of getting any representation, and I'm going to explain why that works. But the point is, people end up thinking that it's a waste of their vote to vote for the small parties, so you end up with 2 broad parties competing with each other for each seat. Now, let me explain that in a little bit more detail. Here we start off with the winner-take-all rules. Each district, say we speak of Congress, 435 legislative districts, or the 100 members of the Senate, 2 from each state. There's only going to be 1 winner for each seat. So the loser gets nothing. And this leads to strategic voting, where voters decide not to support third-party candidates because they think they can't win. It's going to be one of the 2 major parties, either the Republicans or the Democrats, if you like the Greens or the Libertarians or some other party. You think, yeah, I know they're in there, but it'll either be a Republican or a Democrat. You have to get 50% plus 1 vote, and so people end up thinking of voting for a third party is a wasted vote. Well, that lack of voter support for third parties means they do very badly in elections, and then people look at it and say, see, the Libertarians only get 1%, the Green Party only gets 1%. These people could never win, and it becomes a cycle. And then the other factor is that the existing parties have the power then, because they control the government, to structure our elections to keep this going. Now, this is not the only way to do it. I'm going to show you there's another way to do this. So let's compare 2 electoral systems. One, the single-member district system that we have. Parties nominate candidates for each legislative seat in these individual districts. So if a state like Illinois has, 18 or 19 members of the House, or whatever it may be, any state, whatever number they have, there's a separate race in each district, and there can only be 1 winner. That's what we mean by winner take all. The candidate who gets the most votes in each district wins that seat. And almost everywhere, you have to get a majority. So that what that would mean is that the top two candidates would be in a runoff. If you end up with three candidates and nobody gets 50% plus one, the loser, the lowest candidate drops out, and the top two have a runoff. This means that only parties that can win a majority in some district can hope to have any representation at all. So, you could have a party, let's say the Green Party or the Libertarian Party. Let's say in every district in the state of Illinois, they have 10% support. But there's no district, there's no place where they have 50%. So they run at 10% in every district, and how many seats do they get? 0. They get no seats at all. And because people don't want to throw away their votes, it just gets worse. Since people know they're not going to win, they don't vote for them. And since they don't vote for them, they do very badly, and people think, oh, well, it's pointless to vote for them. But there's another way to do it, and this illustrates the difference. It's called proportional representation, or PR. In a PR system, now there's different ways to do this. This is the simplest method I can come up with. This is called the list method. Parties list candidates. The parties pick the candidates. They'll list, let's say if we have 18 legislative districts, they pick 18 candidates. They rank them from 1 to 18. Republicans do that. The Democrats do that. The Libertarians do that. The Greens do that. All the parties pick 18. There are 18 candidates and rank them in order. Because theoretically, a party could win all the seats, right? But they won't, because here's what happens next. The voters choose parties rather than candidates. You vote for your party. And then the legislature is staffed from the party lists, starting from number 1 and going down. So, for example, if a party gets 40% of the vote, they get 40% of the legislators. And they go right down the list from number 1 to whatever number gives them 40% of the legislators. And usually there's a threshold. Sometimes you have to win at least like 5% or 3% to get any candidate. So a party that has almost no support doesn't get any legislators. But point being, a party that got, let's say, 10% of the overall vote, they're going to get 10% or maybe more of the representatives. And, so that leads to, instead of people saying, I don't want to vote for a third or fourth party because they'll get nothing. Instead, they say, I'm going to vote for a party that I like, that I agree with, because they'll at least be able to participate in government. And I want to send, to see to it, if it's 10%, then 10% of the legislature will be Libertarians, or 10% will be Greens. And because they like those parties, then they're happy. And often what this leads to is a multi-party system where you have to form a governing coalition, not just one party. So let's do a comparison, all right? On the left, you see the U.S. House of Representatives. And this is as of 2022. It could pick any year you want, but that's 2022. 435 members. And you can see, as of this point, how it was balanced. 222 Democrats, 211 Republicans, and as it happens, 2 vacant seats. But do you see any third parties? You see any fourth parties? Any Greens? You see any Libertarians? Nope. Now look over on the, although, there are members of both parties who identify with those small parties and their ideologies, but they normally run as Republicans and Democrats so that they can win. Now look at the Knesset. This is the legislature in Israel over on the right. They have a multi-party system. They have proportional representation. And you see what they end up with? Look at all the different parties. And so the government, which is at the top, and then the opposition, those are not parties. Those are coalitions. There's a governing coalition that's voting together by agreement, and an opposing coalition. And you can see the governing coalition is comprised of a whole multitude of parties who went 17 seats, 8 seats, 7 seats, etc. The opposition and all those other opposition parties. So when you have proportional representation, it can facilitate a multi-party system where you need coalitions. Now, you can decide for yourself whether you think our system is better or worse, but note what the electoral system does. But there is more. There are other reasons why we have a two-party system. For example, the two main parties make life absolutely miserable for the third party. Since they have all the power, they structure rules that make it hard for third parties to get going. For example, requiring enormous numbers of signatures from a whole bunch of different counties just for a party to get on the ballot. Year after year, election after election. They make it hard for them to do that. And there's a thing called fusion voting, which has been banned almost everywhere in the country. There's a few states like New York that still have some of it. But fusion voting is where a minor party, let's take the Greens Party, right? The Greens Party can nominate the same candidate as the Democrats. The Libertarians, if they want, can nominate the same party as the Republicans, the same candidate as the Republicans. And the candidate, like let's say it's Joe Biden, and let's say he's nominated by the Democrats. He can also be nominated by the Greens. They can just choose to nominate him. What that would mean is you can vote for Joe Biden as a candidate of either party. He would appear on 2 ballot lines on your ballot. Doesn't make any difference. He still, in terms of the outcome, he still gets the votes either way. But it shows how many people like that party. And if you start to see a lot of people voting as Greens, for example, then it shows the Greens matter, the Greens have power, they can get support because they say we really matter. A lot of people like us. So same thing if you have Libertarians. You could vote, let's say, for Trump as a Libertarian, or Trump can be nominated as a Republican and as a Libertarian, and you could vote for him under the Libertarian ticket if you want to. It's either way, it doesn't matter in terms of the outcome. The same person gets elected, but then we know which party people really like. Well, that type of voting has been banned by parties. And then we have gerrymandering where they redraw legislative districts every 10 years just to favor Republicans and Democrats and make it impossible for anyone else to get in. Then there's this thing we call de-alignment, which is the rise of independent voting and candidate-centered politics. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but that is where candidates take advantage of interest group support, which we talked about, and the money that comes from them to basically just run their own campaigns and say, to heck with the parties. I don't need a party. I mean, they want a party nomination. I don't mean that. They definitely want the party's nomination. But they don't need the party. They don't need the party to run their campaign as much as they used to, because they can fund the campaign themselves, hire their own consultants, put together their own organization that is loyal to them. And the party may disagree with them, but the party can't really make them do much. And then we also have many voters who simply prefer candidates over parties. They say, I vote for whichever candidate I think is the best. Many voters say that now. So all that leads to a decline in influence of parties. And this has kind of supported, I guess you would say, our two-party system, simply because it's really hard for third parties to get going. People aren't really, they're thinking more about candidates than they are about parties. If they think of an insurgent movement or challenging the system, they think of a candidate or a person rather than a party. Now, the other thing is that the major parties have gotten good at appealing to voters who don't like them. They call them centrists or independents or D-line voters. The parties have found ways to appeal to them through populist rhetoric and other things. And we also have just the familiarity that we have as Americans with two parties. We think that's the way it should be. It's a tradition. A lot of people just sort of inherited their party ID from their parents. My parents are Democrats or Republicans, so I'm a Democrat or Republican. And as I said, just the belief, not just Duverger's law, but also a sort of spoiler belief that, people feel almost ashamed to vote for a third party. Why? Because the candidate you most liked is the one you heard. So in other words, if someone says that they are inclined to the left politically, but they voted for Jill Stein rather than Hillary Clinton, then sometimes people get mad at them and say, well, you help the side that you oppose the most because you threw away your vote. So there's a stigma almost attached sometimes, or a spoiler logic that is attached to voting for third parties. And so all these things just support the notion that we're just going to have two. Pros and cons of this system, as I said, you can like it or dislike it. It has been argued that it produces stability. Also, usually it leads to it's clear which party is in charge. Now, that is not always the case, but sometimes we get what we call divided government, where we have a Republican president and a Democratic Congress or vice versa. That's called divided government, and that can be a real pain. It can get stalemate. But theoretically, you could put one party in charge, and usually speaking, that's the case until recently. And then it forces the various groups within each party, to try to agree with each other. It forges a kind of consensus. And theoretically also, it helps to produce some voting consistency and voting blocks in Congress. And people can organize bipartisanship. They can reach across just two parties to find partners. Now, the cons, or the reasons it's two parties are considered not enough, is the lack of choice. And many people just say, I don't like either of these parties. I want something more to the left, more to the right. Many voters just feel disaffected and drop away from politics. We have very low voter turnout in this country generally. That might be one reason. A lack of new ideas, parties just stuck in the past, In the past, another criticism was that, well, sometimes it seems like a single party with two wings, not that different. Well, now it's bitter polarization. Right now we have two parties, and they're just at each other's throats all the time. And then when we enter these periods of divided government, we have a real problem on our hands. We can't get anything done. But never count out third parties entirely, because sometimes there have been a number of elections where they have been very, very significant in determining the outcome as essentially spoilers. 1912, Teddy Roosevelt didn't get the Republican nomination for president. So he founded the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. He got 27% of the vote. Now that's pretty solid, right? And that led to, even though he was a Republican, Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican, that helped elect a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, who got 42% of the vote and got elected. 1994, Ross Perot, a far-right Republican, billionaire, ran a self-funded third-party campaign, called it the Reform Party. Well, he got 19% of the vote and helped Bill Clinton win with 43% of the vote. 2000, Ralph Nader got the Green Party nomination. The whole election hinged on Florida. It was an extremely close election. Ralph Nader got 97,000 votes in Florida as a Green Party nominee. Bush won that state by 537 votes. Now imagine if even 600 of those 97,000 votes that Nader got had gone to Al Gore. I mean, the Green Party is a party of the left. Al Gore was a Democrat. I think it's very clear that Nader helped George Bush become president, which he did for 8 years. 2016, Trump won the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, those are states that Democrats needed to win, and they were previously solidly usually Democratic in presidential elections. The total number of votes he got was, if you added up the margin, in all three of those states, it was 80,000. That's how close it was. 3 states combined, a margin of 80,000 votes. Very close. Well, in each of those 3 states, Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee, got more votes than Trump's margin of victory. In other words, if Jill Stein's voters had voted for Hillary Clinton in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, instead of voting for Jill Stein, Hillary Clinton would have won the presidency. And another thing that third parties do, in addition to sometimes being spoilers, is they introduce new issues and bring new groups of people into the political process. And so that can be a good thing. Now, I just note that if we had other parties, what would they be? Well, one possibility I mentioned is on the left would be social democratic parties, Democratic Socialists of America, this sort of thing, green parties, even a communist party. I mean, these parties do exist; they just can't win. And on the right, they're in Europe they have fascist, Christian democratic, religious parties, conservative, libertarian. These are all possibilities that we could have if we had more parties. And maybe we'd have ecological parties besides the Greens. Who knows what we'd have. But it's a theoretical thing. If we changed our electoral system, if we made some other changes, maybe something like that could happen. Now, I'm going to give you a quick run through American history and talk about the evolution of American party systems. We organized the history of parties in this country into party systems. And it's a way of breaking up American history and understanding American politics. It was a time, each one of these is a period that had a characteristic power relationship and certain key issues. They start with critical elections, which are also called electoral realignments. So note those terms, they will definitely be on the exam. Critical elections, or sometimes called electoral realignments. There have been 7 party systems in this country. The first, 1788 to 1800, and then you can see as they go down, the Federalist era, the Jeffersonian era, the Jacksonian era, the post-Civil War era, the Progressive era, the New Deal era, and the era of divided government and de-alignment. And we'll go through them one by one. The first party system is from the founding with the Constitution to 1800, and some would say it was a pre-party system. It was before we actually had party systems, but to me it makes more sense to understand that the Federalists really were a party, and they ran the country for 12 years. They were a political party. We didn't call them that exactly. And James Madison in Federalist number 10 talks about the danger of factions, which could include parties. But Presidents Washington and Adams were Federalists. Alexander Hamilton, Federalist. They wanted a strong national government. And during this time, Thomas Jefferson, who you see there on the right, organized the first intentionally organized political party, the Democratic Republican Party. And so when they came up to the election of 1800, there were the Federalists running against the Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson saw like a nation of farmers, and the Federalists saw us as a vast commercial republic. Jefferson wanted strong states, basically like under the Articles of Confederation. Adams and the Federalists wanted a strong national government. And Jefferson won. It inaugurates the Jeffersonian era, and that lasted from 1800 to 1828. And interestingly, even though it was supposedly going to be all about strong states, it really wasn't. It was a period of national expansion. You note the Louisiana Purchase, you can see it there outlined. Jefferson bought this enormous amount of land from France. That was the period of the Monroe Doctrine, when President Monroe said the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of interest, and told the European colonial powers to stay out, go elsewhere. Also the War of 1812, a number of other things happened, but that's what was going on, massive territorial expansion. The third party system is 1828 to 1860. We call that the Jacksonian era, named after Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1828. And again, this is where you start to see a massive controversy brewing in this country that ends in the Civil War over slavery. What split the country, and this is the key issue from 1828 to 1860, was slavery, and particularly the question of whether slavery would exist in the new territories. All those little pieces of land that you see there, the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession after the Mexican War, etc., all these acquisitions of land raised the same question. Will slavery be legal in those territories or not? And it became an irreconcilable problem in our political system that led to the Civil War, and ultimately, as you know, during the Civil War, that's how we resolved it. I mean, the North won, the South lost. At that time, though, interestingly, the South was more Democratic, and the North was more Republican. Now it's very different. It's the opposite now. But the Democratic Party pre-Civil War, the Jacksonian Democratic Party, was in support of slavery. It was the party of the South. And the Republicans came into existence in the 1850s as an anti-slavery party. And so we end up with the fourth party system here. 1860 to 1896, the post-Civil War era. Now, it was a party called the Whigs in the 1850s. They fell apart and became, out of their remnants emerged the new Republican Party in 1854. And the new rivalry became that of Republicans versus Democrats, which is what we have today. And we began to see North-South sectionalism, which we have today. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the first Republican president. The Civil War happened in the 1860s. And because the Democrats were the party of the South, and the South lost the war. You can see there the 1860 election. You see the red; those are all the states that were won by Lincoln, and then you can see the blue states down below. Those are the states that were won by. There were several candidates. It's a complicated election, but the point is that it is an election that led to the secession of the southern states and the creation of the Confederacy. The big issues from 1860 through 1896, though, was the rise of the Industrial Revolution, because the Republicans won, the North won, and the federal government was dominated during this period by the Republican Party as the party of industry, the party of the growth of the corporate sector. And the Democrats were in the agrarian South, and for the most part were not in power during this time, except in states. Then we come up to the critical election of 1896, an election in which the Republican Party nominated William McKinley, who outspent William Jennings Bryan 5-1, and it was the first election that used modern Democratic campaign techniques. And Republicans continued to dominate U.S. politics until 1932. So you can see again, now note again, the Republicans are the party of the North, and the Democrats are still the party of the South. Now this is going to switch in the 1960s. And by the way, The Wizard of Oz, which many of you are familiar with, is generally considered to be an allegory about the 1896 election. It was a book that became a beloved movie. But the theory of it is that these characters exemplify forces in the 1896 election. So, for example, the Scarecrow represents the farmer. The Cowardly Lion represents William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate. The Tin Woodsman represents organized labor, the unions, based in the cities, the industrial workers. Dorothy represents the ordinary American. The Wicked Witches of the East and West represent the big banking interests of the two coasts. The city of Oz, why is it OZ? Because Oz, remember they follow a yellow brick road to Oz? Okay. Big issue in that campaign was whether our money should be backed by gold. It's called the gold standard. And how do we weigh gold? In ounces. And what's the abbreviation for ounce? OZ, hence the city of Oz. And the yellow brick road, which symbolizes the gold standard. So there are other examples as well, but that allegory is, it appears that was what the author had in mind, or at least he was inspired by it to a substantial extent. But it's an interesting way to think about the movie, right? The fifth party system goes from 1896 to 1932. That is the era that we call the Progressive Era. Now, again, it was Republicans running the country up until the economic crash of 1929, which leads to the rise of the Democrats. And during this time, we see the rise of organized labor, of unions, the Grange movement, populism, progressivism, increasing regulation of the industrial economy, a criticism of the old laissez-faire, get the government out of business ideology, the rise of the vast, vast fortunes of industrial robber barons, as they call them, and the progressive Republicans trying to do what they call trust busting, which is breaking up the gigantic monopolies that were strangling the economy, and it contributed in part to the crash of 1929. Also, we see the Spanish-American War, and World War I, and the emergence of the United States as a global military and diplomatic power during this time. The six-party system is 1932 to 1980. We call this the New Deal era. Total Democratic dominance, almost total, for many, many years. The coalition that supported the New Deal voters, the New Deal politicians, mainly Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was elected president 4 times, or the urban political machines like we have in Chicago and other cities, farmers, unions, white Southerners, minorities. It's a period of Democratic dominance. A very powerful dominance of the Democratic Party, uniting a lot of different types of people. It involved recovery from the Great Depression and also winning World War II. It involved the Cold War period and a relative consensus on economic policy. We did not have bitter disagreement between Republicans and Democrats over most aspects of economic policy. A consensus on fighting the Cold War, a consensus that we had to be strong economically and militarily. But it began, the coalition began to fragment in the 1960s over what? Over civil rights. So let's talk about that. The New Deal coalition began to collapse in the 60s. Why? Because the Democratic Party switched. Instead of being a party that supported white Southerners, the Democratic Party shifted and began to embrace the cause of civil rights and racial minorities. They began to particularly fight against segregation of the African American population in the South. And when they did that, they lost the South. And it was during the 60s when everything flipped. So if you look at the 1960 presidential election, you can see the Democrats winning almost all the southern states. So that's on the left. Now, if you look at 1968, that is the orange, that is George Wallace. George Wallace, he was a Democrat who switched and formed his own party. He was a racist governor of Alabama who ran on basically an entirely racist platform, and he won as a third-party candidate. He took the South away from the Democratic Party, and ultimately Richard Nixon won the election. And from that point on, what happened was Republicans began to win the South, and they still do to this day. By 1980, the South was a Republican stronghold, and the Democrats, who had become a much more liberal, progressive party of civil rights, now were winning the North. So the states that the Republicans used to win in the North now became Democratic states, which they still are mostly, like as with the Western states, and the South became totally Republican. So like you can see here the difference between 1960 and 1980. Where the South switched from being Democratic to being Republican, which it is to this day. Now we come to the seventh party system, the one we're in now. It is sometimes, I'm calling it the era of divided government, because we have very intense balanced party competition, but often a paralyzed government, and that's a huge problem. Reagan started this with this whole idea that government is the problem, not the solution. And from 1980 to 2016, we saw the rise of the so-called conservative wing of the Republican Party and the so-called neoliberals in the Democratic Party, meaning both parties moved to the right. The Republicans moved to the right, and the Democrats moved to the right. But 2016 appears to have been another turning point. We'll have to see, but it appears that since 2016 and Trump, that the Republicans are not just a conservative party, they are a party of the far right. And since 2016, the Democrats have started moving more to the progressive left, at least in the House of Representatives. It's not in all levels, but there is some indication that progressives are coming more to the front in the Democratic Party. But there's no doubt that the Republican Party is completely dominated by its right wing. So the era of divided government I was just talking about, I mean, that refers to one party controlling the presidency while the other party controls one or both houses of Congress. And it's been going on since 1968, off and on, and it results in conflict and it forces people to try to compromise, yeah, theoretically, but if they can't compromise, you end up with government paralysis and shutdown. And I've just listed the years. The Nixon and Ford presidencies, 8 years of divided government, 4 years of unified government under Carter, then 12 years of divided government, I mean, and on and on and on. You can see Clinton had to deal with it. Obama had 2 years of a unified government. Trump had 2 years of a unified government, and that's the way, Biden, Trump, and Obama all start off with 2 years of controlling everything and then losing Congress. So this sort of thing has just been, we call this divided government, and it leads to paralysis, conflict, and sometimes government shutdowns. So as I said, just take another look at this. The South has remained Republican in almost every election since 1968. There's 60 and there's 68. And now I want to jump ahead to 2016 and 2020, and you see the pattern holding in 2016 and 2018, Republicans dominating the South, the only state. Now, Biden did win one southern state barely, which was Georgia. He barely won that state, but he did win it. But other than that, these patterns have been roughly stable since 1968. So where are we today? This is our final slide for this presentation. The state of the parties is really that the Democrats have a progressive wing that is rising, particularly supported by younger voters. They are dissatisfied with the so-called neoliberal or corporate Democrats. The Republican Party is just completely dominated by its far-right wing. There's been a breakdown of rules and norms of civility and bipartisanship in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Just, real bomb throwing by people who just find the other party just loathsome and they don't want to work with each other. And a lot of political dysfunction. And we're facing different issues and challenges than we have in the past, and it's a question of whether we're facing them very well. There's been an enormous increase in economic and political inequality in this country, and it is very disturbing, and it leads to a lot of instability. We see the rise of right-wing populism with actual Nazis and fascists marching around in the streets, waving torches and this sort of thing. Engaging in acts of violence, groups like Proud Boys and the 3%ers and Oath Keepers, and people running around the streets with assault rifles threatening their political opponents. And at the same time, while we're doing this, we have global warming and other environmental challenges that need to be dealt with soon. Massive global trends in migration, immigration, war, and peace that we need to take a position on and are having a hard time uniting around. And a lot of demographic trends that are kind of disturbing that we have to talk more about, which, for example, the baby boom generation that is enormous is aging. And when this generation of older people is on Social Security and Medicare, that means that it's good in one way if they retire because it opens up jobs for young people. But, where will the money come from to pay for the costs of Social Security, of Medicare, etc.? All these programs need to be properly financed. Now, that is all very doable. We can certainly do all that. But the question is, how do we get the unity to do it? How do we get Congress and the presidency aligned, not just for 2 years or 4 years, but for 8 or 10 or 12 years? How do we get them to unite for a long time to sustain responses to all these problems? Countries with authoritarian governments and one-party systems, like China, they have no problem charting a course for 20 years. But with changing party control of our government, we often can't sustain an initiative. So a Democrat comes in and signs up to cooperate with NATO and other countries, and then a Republican president comes in and overturns all the agreements, and then a Democrat comes in and signs up again. Well, how is that supposed to work? The Iran nuclear deal, for example, negotiated by Obama, broken by Trump, renegotiated in process by Biden. And that's just one example. There could be many others. So how do we meet all these big challenges if we can't make long-term solutions? And of course, changing party control and divided government make those things more difficult. But we'll talk more about some of these issues in the next video. So thanks for your attention. And that's the end of the first of 2 videos on political parties.